to do a demo video of the grader project 3, just because it seemed a little challenging. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to have to read off the steps to you, and I'll just display the Excel spreadsheet as I'm doing the steps. So since I already have the file open and saved, I'll go ahead and start with step 2. And it says, on the subtotals worksheet, use the sort dialog box to sort the data by employee and further sort by category, both in alphabetical order. So let's go through our tabs here. And let's see, so on my data tab, oops, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong one here. Let's stay on I was thinking of subtotals. Let's stay on the home tab. And here's my sort and filter. So I'm going to select all the data as well too, or the entire range. And let's go to the sort and filter button and do the custom sort. And so first it wants me to sort the data by employee in alphabetical order. So I'll select employee, and it's already A to Z. And then I need to add a level, and then further sort by category, again in alphabetical order. So it looks like that's everything for step 2. It's sorted first by employee, and then by category. So step 3 says use the subtotal features to insert subtotal rows by employee to calculate the total expense by employee. So this one's worded kind of weird. So let's think it through kind of word by word, and we'll figure out the steps. So let's just first start by finding the subtotals. And that is under the data tab all the way at the end here in the outline group. So if I click on the subtotals button, and if I'm looking at my instructions, it wants me to insert subtotals row by employee. So it looks like it defaulted to expense. So I'm going to change that to employee. And it wants me to calculate the total expense value by employee. So now I got to read between the lines here a little bit. So total, I'm going to assume is synonymous with sum. And they want me to total the expense by employee. So it looks like it's defaulting to category here. So I'm going to change that to expense. And then let's go ahead and hit OK, and we'll run it and see how it comes out. So it looks like I'm OK here. So I've got each one of the employees separated. So I start with Abbott, Donaldson, Hart, Miller, Overton, and right below each one gives me a total category for each employee. So it looks like I'm OK on step 3. So let's go ahead and move on to step 4. They want us to collapse the Donaldson and Hart sections to show only their totals. Leave the other employee individual rows displayed. So you can see it's broken up by employee. So they want me to collapse this one, the Donaldson and the Hart. So if I go over to the far left-hand side of the screen, I've got these little minus signs, so I can collapse it, each one of the employees like that. So I'm going to collapse Donaldson and Hart. So now I just have their total rows and not each one of the individual categories. So that is it for step 4. So step 5, they want us to use the expenses worksheet to create a blank pivot table on a new worksheet named Summary. Name the pivot table categories. So again, this is one that's kind of long-winded, but it's one of the more simple steps here, but it's one that's easy to overthink. So first they want us to move over to this expenses worksheet here. And I'm going to go and insert a pivot table. So I went over to the Insert tab in the Tables group and I selected Pivot Table. And it went ahead and defaulted to the correct range. And it defaults to a new worksheet. So I'm going to say OK. Next, it wants me to name the worksheet Summary. So they're talking about the new worksheet that I created for this pivot table. So it's going to default to sheet name 1. So I'm going to rename it Summary. Be really careful when you're doing this. Make sure it's spelled and capitalized. There's no extra spaces in this, because at this point, if you spell the name of the worksheet wrong, it won't give you credit for any of the steps that you do on this pivot table. If the worksheet is named improperly. So just be mindful of all the little details from this point on. So let's do the last little step in part step 5. It says name the pivot table categories. So if I remember right, I'm going to right click here and let's go down. So all I did was right click in the little area here where it says pivot table. Let's go to pivot table options. And it looks like that worked. So right here, the very first field is a pivot table name, and they want us to change the name from the default name to categories. So I'm going to check it, make sure everything is spelled correctly. Again, that's where most of your mistakes are going to come from. It's going to be a misspelling as opposed to the technique being done improperly. So again, just to emphasize the notion of just being mindful of the little tiny details, because unfortunately the software picks up on some of those instead of being more discreet and picking up the fact that you're probably doing the method right. It'll sometimes mark things incorrect if there's a misspelling. So let's go ahead and hit OK. We can check it. So it changes the name to categories. So let's move on to step 6. Step 6 says use the category and expense fields, enabling Excel to determine where the fields go in the pivot table. Again, this is worded kind of weird again, but all they're telling us to do is do this in order. So they want us to use the category and expense fields, enabling Excel to determine where the fields go. So they're telling us they want us to do this in order, and Excel will determine where the fields will be placed in this pivot table on its own. So let's just click on the expenses field first. So that's over here, right here in this pivot table fields area on the right hand side. So I'm just going to select expenses. Oops, actually I did that wrong. Oops, sorry, they want us to do category first and then expense. So it defaults to, it puts the category field in the rows section and the expense in the values section. So again, that's one that's worded kind of weird, but it's really just a really simple step that I even screwed up trying to do it. So just be careful with ones like that. So let's move on to step 7. It says modify the values field to determine the average expense by category. Change the custom name to average expense. So it looks like there's two parts to this. They want us to modify the values field to determine the average expense. So let's start with that. So I'm going to go over to the right hand side, this pivot table fields section. I'm down here in the values field area, and right now it's defaulting to the sum of the expense. If I hit this little drop down arrow and I get the value field settings, they want us to change this to the average expense. So right now it's set at sum. So I'm going to change it to average. And next they want us to change the custom name to average expense. So right now it's average of expense. They want us to change this to, just take out the of there and just make it average expense. So be careful here, make sure you just have one space in between average and expense. Again, just like the other little trivial steps, they'll take off points if there's an extra space here or a misspelling. So let's move on to step 8. Format the value fields to accounting number type. So I still have this dialog box open, the value field settings dialog box. And I'm going to click on this number format button in the lower left hand corner. And I'm going to select accounting. And I'm going to have it defaults to 2 decimal places. I'm going to leave it like that because it doesn't say anything about changing the decimal places. And it looks like there's some values beyond the decimal point here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is. And then it looks like we're done as far as messing with the settings of this field. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And you can see that kind of cleans it up here a little bit. So step 9 says type the word category in cell A3 and change the grand totals layout option to on for rows only. So let's start with the first part. I'm just going to, so it looks like cell A3 is already selected. So they just want me to change the title of this column to category. So, okay. Change the grand totals layout option to on for rows only. So let's see if I remember how to do this right. Let's click on the design tab. Okay. So if I click on the design tab, I want to make sure that I have a cell selected too in the pivot table so that I have these options to work with the pivot table. And if I go over to the layout section, it says grand totals, and they want me to select on for rows only. So moving on to step 10, they want me to apply pivot style dark 2 and display banded rows. They have a little note down here too. It says depending upon the version of Office being used, the style name may be light blue pivot style dark 2. So that's probably the one we're going to want to, that's probably the name we're going to want to look for, is this light blue pivot style dark 2. So here's our pivot table styles group, and I'm going to hit the drop down here. So they're telling me dark. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm not even going to go to the light and the medium. And I'm going to drag my cursor over each one of the styles. So here's light blue, pivot style, dark 2. So I've applied that, and next they want me to display banded rows. So here's I'm going to go over to the pivot table style options and display banded rows. So let's move on to step 11. Insert a slicer for the employee field. Change the slicer height to 2 inches and apply the slicer style dark 5. Move the slicer below the pivot table. And let's read the note here as well. It says, depending on the version of Office being used, the style name may be light blue slicer style dark 5. I'm assuming we're going to look for this light blue slicer style dark 5. So let's insert a slicer first. And let's do this. Let's look it up. I don't even know if I remember how to do that. How to insert a slicer in Excel. So I'm pretty sure I know how to do this, but I want you guys to just see that if I don't, I can always look it up and find it, a video or some instructions on how to do that. So it says, click anywhere in the pivot table for which you want to insert a slicer. Click on the Pivot Table Analyze tab, Insert Slicer. So let's just start with that. That should be enough to get us through here. So it tells us to go to the Pivot Table, Analyze, and it looks like here in the Filter group, there's an Insert Slicer tab. So if I go back to my instructions, they want me to insert a slicer for the employee field. So I'm going to select the employee field, and next they want me to change the slicer height to 2 inches and apply slicer dark 5. Move the slicer below the pivot table. Okay. So let's say OK. And so once I hit OK, here's my slicer, or the field that I sliced out of that. And then it gives me some options to work with the slicer now once I have it selected. So they want me to change the height to 2 inches. So I'm going to hit 2 and then enter. Then you can see it makes the rows for each one of the field names a little bit larger. And they want me to change the style, so I'm going to go over to the slicer style to 14. So to be exact, it's light blue, slicer style dark 5. Actually, I'm sorry. So I'm going to go through the dark, and you can see I'm just running my cursor over each one of the options. So I'm going to go over to the 5th one, and it's light blue, slicer style dark 5. So that makes each one of the boxes a little bit darker. And I'm going to move the slicer over below the pivot table. Okay. So let's move on to step 12. So they want us to use the expenses worksheet to create another blank pivot table on a sheet named totals. Add the employee to the rows and add the expense field to the values area. Sort the pivot table from largest to smallest. Okay. So again, this is one that's kind of easy to overthink, but let's just go step by step. So they want us to start with the expenses table again. So they want us to create another pivot table. So I'm going to go to the Insert tab, Pivot Table. They want us to put it on another worksheet. So it defaults to putting it on another worksheet. So I'm going to say OK. And it says it wants us to name this new sheet totals. So let's rename it capital T totals. Add employee to the rows. So I can do this as well too. I'm going to just select employee. I'm going to hold down my mouse and bring it over to rows. And I'm going to bring the expense fields over to the value. So I'm going to select the expense field and bring it over to values. And they want me to sort the pivot table from largest to smallest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, I'm going to just select a cell in the pivot table. I'm going to right click it, and I'm going to sort. So after I right click it, it brings me a drop down and it wants me to sort from largest to smallest. So I've got it sorted by expenses from largest to smallest now, so it looks like we're good with step 13. So I'm sorry, from step 12. So step 13 wants us to change the name for the expenses column to totals and format the field with accounting number format. So I'm going to go back over to my pivot table fields, and expenses is my values category. So I'm going to hit the